I'm Claire Calloway, 34, and the lawyer's office smelled like lemon polish and old paper, and I remember thinking, absurdly, that my father would have hated that smell. He liked things that smelled like something, cedar, coffee, motor oil. Not lemon polish pretending to be clean. "I'm sorry, Ms. Calloway," the attorney said. He wasn't sorry. His face had the practiced blankness of a man who read wills for a living and had learned a long time ago that grief makes people say things they regret, so it was safer to say nothing at all. "The estate goes to Diane Calloway in its entirety. Real property, investment accounts, the business, all of it." Diane sat 2 chairs down from me in a black dress that still had the tags cut off that morning. I noticed the faint thread marks at the seam. She didn't look at me. She looked at her nails. 12 years. I had fed my father applesauce with a spoon because his hands shook too badly to hold one. I had learned to change a catheter bag at 2 a.m. without turning on the overhead light, because the light hurt his eyes. I had sat in a folding chair beside his hospital bed for 6 months, reading him chapters of westerns he'd already read twice, because the sound of my voice, the nurses said, kept his blood pressure from spiking. Diane had married him 4 years ago, when I was already deep into the caretaking, already exhausted, already the daughter who never left. She'd shown up to exactly 9 of his appointments. I know because I kept a log. Not for revenge, just because someone had to keep track of his medications, and it turned out I was the only one who did. "There has to be a mistake," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt, which is its own kind of small miracle. "There's no mistake," Diane said, finally looking at me. Her voice had the practiced sweetness of a woman delivering bad news to someone she considered beneath negotiation. "Your father loved you very much, but he understood near the end who was really taking care of things." I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I stood up, thanked the attorney for his time, and walked out into a Tuesday afternoon that did not care that my entire life had just been quietly erased by a woman who'd learned my father's signature better than she'd ever learned his birthday. Here is what nobody in that office knew. 3 weeks before he died, my father had called someone, not his lawyer, the estate lawyer, the one Diane had picked out and driven him to see twice a year like clockwork. He'd called a different number, a number that belonged to a woman named Patricia Ames, who ran patient advocacy at Brookhaven Nursing Home, where he'd spent the last 8 months of his life after the stroke that took his ability to write. I didn't know about that call yet. Nobody did, but my father had asked for one specific thing before he died. That Patricia wait and reach out to me herself only once the funeral was behind me. That call was already coming. I just didn't know it yet. What you need to understand first is how we got here. Because a woman doesn't inherit $2.3 million by accident. She builds toward it, quietly, for years, the way water finds a crack in a foundation, and just keeps going. My father, Walter Calloway, built a mid-sized commercial roofing company from nothing. By the time I was in college, Calloway Roofing and Restoration had 11 trucks and a reputation, in 3 counties, for never missing a deadline. My mother died when I was 26, ovarian cancer, 11 brutal months, and my father was never quite whole again. He kept working. He kept smiling at company barbecues, but something in him had gone quiet. Diane arrived 2 years later. She was younger than my mother, sharper-edged, and very good at noticing what a grieving, lonely man needed to hear. Within 18 months, they were married in a courthouse ceremony my father didn't even tell me about until after. A detail I forgave. At the time, because grief makes people erratic, and I wanted him to be happy. The stroke came the year after that, and that's when Diane's real project began. I moved back into the guest room of my father's house, 11 months after his stroke, when it became clear Diane had no intention of managing his care herself. She said she wasn't built for hospitals. She said watching him struggle broke her heart too much to be useful. So I became useful instead. I quit a marketing job I'd worked 12 years to build. I learned physical therapy exercises from a laminated sheet the hospital sent home with him. I learned to recognize the specific quality of silence that meant he was in pain, but too proud to ask for the medication. Diane, meanwhile, learned where the estate documents were kept. I noticed things in that period that I filed away without fully understanding why. The way she'd ask him to sign things so the accountant doesn't nag me, holding a pen to his weakened hand and guiding it like she was helping a child learn cursive. The way she scheduled his estate attorney visits on days I had physical therapy appointments with him, so I was never in the room. The way she started referring to the house, in front of guests, as my house, months before anything had legally changed. I told myself I was imagining a villain where there was only a stressed, imperfect stepmother. That was my first mistake, and it would cost me almost everything. The moment I couldn't explain away happened 8 months before he died, on a Sunday. I'd stepped out to grab his prescriptions, and when I came back, Diane was at the kitchen table with a manila folder and a man in a gray suit I didn't recognize. My father sat between them, tired, his signature already drying on a page I wasn't allowed to see. "Estate planning," Diane said breezily, sliding the folder into her bag before I could get close enough to read it. "Boring adult stuff. You don't need to worry about it." I should have demanded to see that folder. I didn't. I was too tired, too stretched thin managing catheters and medication schedules and the slow, unbearable math of watching my father disappear one function at a time. To fight a woman who smiled at me like we were on the same team. We were never on the same team. My father was moved to Brookhaven Nursing Home for round-the-clock care in his final 8 months. After a second, smaller stroke made in-home care unsafe. I visited every day. Diane visited, by the facility's own sign-in log, 11 times total. I know this because after he died, I requested that log. Not out of suspicion yet. Out of grief, honestly. I wanted a record of who had been there with him at the end, the way you save ticket stubs from a concert you loved. What the log actually showed me was a pattern. Diane's visits clustered almost entirely around 3 specific weeks, the same 3 weeks I'd later learn, that a notary and an estate attorney had also signed into the building. But at the time, all I knew was this: my father was dying, slowly and with dignity, and I was the one holding his hand through it, and Diane was somewhere else, building whatever she was building. He died on a Thursday morning in March, with my hand in his and the sound of a hospital-grade humidifier hissing in the background. His last full sentence to me, 3 days earlier, had been this: "You've always been the one who actually showed up." I held on to that sentence like a life raft, all the way through the funeral, all the way through the reading of the will that gutted it. Because if he meant that, and I believe, to this day, that he did, then something had happened to the paperwork that didn't match what was in his heart. I want to tell you about the funeral reception first, because it's the last time I saw Diane before everything changed, and I've never forgotten it. She stood in the receiving line in a dress with the tags freshly cut, accepting condolences with a hand pressed lightly to her collarbone, the universal gesture of a woman performing grief for an audience. When my father's old foreman, Reuben, a man who'd worked for him for 18 years, took her hand and said, "Walter was the best boss I ever had," Diane smiled and said, "He talked about you all the time." Robert. His name was Reuben. She'd never once gotten it right, in 4 years of marriage, and she wasn't about to start now that there was no one left to correct her. Later, near the coffee station, I heard her tell one of my father's old golfing friends, "It's just been so much handling everything myself." Handling everything herself? I had spent the previous 6 months learning to suction a feeding tube. She caught me watching her and crossed the room, condolence voice fully engaged. "You did so much for him," she said, squeezing my forearm just a beat too long. "He'd want you taken care of. We'll figure out something fair." 3 days later, in the attorney's office, something fair turned out to mean nothing at all. I went no contact with Diane 4 days after the will was read, not dramatically. No screaming phone call, no social media post daring her to explain herself. I simply stopped answering. I let her 3 voicemails, increasingly saccharine, then increasingly annoyed, sit unheard on my phone. Silence, I was learning, could be its own kind of leverage. A woman who expects a reaction and receives nothing at all starts to wonder what you know. I spent the next several months doing something Diane never once considered I was capable of. I built a file, I requested my father's complete medical records from Brookhaven, including every visitor log, every notation from his care team about his cognitive state, and every internal note from the patient advocacy office, a small, quiet department most families never think to contact, staffed by people whose entire job is to notice when something about a patient's care or a patient's paperwork doesn't sit right. That's where I found Patricia Ames's name for the first time. Not in a memo, but in a voicemail. I almost deleted it, thinking it was a follow-up survey from the facility. The kind every hospital sends after a death, but the woman's voice on the message was careful, deliberate, in a way that made me sit back down. Ms. Calloway, this is Patricia Ames. I'm with the patient advocacy office at Brookhaven. I know it's been a difficult few weeks. Your father asked me, specifically, to reach out to you, and only you, once his affairs had settled. There's no urgency, but I'd appreciate a call back when you're able. I called her back within the hour. He was very clear about the timing, Patricia told me, once we were past the pleasantries. He didn't want this reaching you while the funeral arrangements were still fresh. He said, and I wrote this down because it struck me, he said, let her grieve first. The truth isn't going anywhere. What truth? I asked. My hand had gone cold around the phone. 3 weeks before he passed, your father asked me to witness and document a statement. Not a new will. He told me himself he no longer had the hand control to execute one. But a formal, notarized statement of his intent and his understanding of what had already happened to his estate documents. I sat with that sentence for a long time. Why you? I asked. Why not his own attorney? Because, Patricia said, and I could hear her choosing the words carefully. He told me his existing attorney was chosen by, and answered to, someone he no longer trusted with paperwork. His words. He wanted this kept separate from that entire arrangement. Separately from his existing legal counsel meant separately from the attorney Diane had chosen, driven him to, and hovered over during every visit. He knew. Near the end, weak and slowed and unable to hold a pen steady, my father had still found a way to make one honest call. Patricia stayed on the phone with me for almost 40 minutes that afternoon. In 15 years of patient advocacy work, she told me, my father was one of maybe a dozen residents who'd ever specifically requested her department's help documenting something, rather than simply signing whatever was placed in front of him. He asked me to come to his room on a Tuesday, she said. He'd checked somehow that it was the day your stepmother had a hair appointment. He was very deliberate about that. In his own halting, stroke-slowed words, witnessed and notarized, he'd described exactly what he wanted to happen to his estate, and exactly what he believed had happened to the paperwork Diane had been putting in front of him. He called it, Patricia said, and I wrote this down verbatim because I thought it was remarkable, a paper trail for whoever finally looks. He knew near the end what was happening to him. And instead of confronting Diane directly, too weak, too aware that confrontation might not even reach a courtroom before his body gave out, he'd built a quiet, legally sound record and trusted that someone, eventually, would come looking. He was right. If only Diane had known what was already sitting in that advocacy office's file. She never would have smiled at me across that lawyer's table like she'd already won. The statement, once I obtained it through the probate court, was devastating in its precision. My father detailed, date by date as best his memory allowed, the pattern of signings he'd been guided through, moments he described as having my hand held while a pen moved. During periods his own physician's notes confirmed he was under sedation for post-stroke pain management. It didn't accuse Diane of a crime outright. My father wasn't a lawyer, and Patricia Ames wasn't there to build a prosecution. She was there to document a dying man's true wishes. But paired with the medical records showing his sedation timeline, the notary's visit logs that curiously overlapped with his most heavily medicated days, and his own stated intent, that I, not Diane, should inherit the business and the majority of the estate, because she showed up every single day, when it would have been easier not to. It was enough. It was more than enough. My attorney, a probate specialist I'd hired with the last of my savings, a fierce, unhurried woman named Renata Osei, who took one look at the timeline and got very, very quiet, called it one of the cleanest undue influence cases I've seen in 11 years of practice. We didn't call Diane. We didn't warn her. We filed. She reached out to me 3 weeks later. And this is the part I want you to really sit with, because it tells you everything about who Diane was. She didn't call because she suspected anything legal was coming. She called because the roofing company, mine and my father's for 22 years before she ever existed, was hemorrhaging money under management she'd installed. Her nephew, a 26-year-old with no construction experience and a business degree from a school I'd never heard of. In 4 months, he'd lost the Maryvale School District contract my father had held for a decade. After showing up to the pre-bid walkthrough in loafers and quoting a timeline that didn't account for the district's asbestos abatement requirements. 2 of the 3 senior crew leads, men who'd carried my father's coffin, had quit within weeks of each other. One of them telling me later that the nephew had tried to cut their overtime pay to improve margins during the busiest month of the roofing season. The company voicemail, when I finally worked up the nerve to call it just to hear it ring, played a greeting recorded in the nephew's flat, uncertain voice, stumbling over the pronunciation of my father's own company name. "I need you to talk to the crews," Diane said, her voice bright with the specific desperation of someone who has run out of other options. "They respect you. They listen to you. I'll pay you a consulting fee, obviously." She had no idea, sitting on the other end of that call, that a formal legal challenge to the entire estate had already been filed and served, that a hearing date was already set, that her nephew's mismanagement was about to become the least of her problems. But what she didn't realize was that someone else was already listening, a judge, a court reporter, and a stack of documents that would soon make her consulting fee offer feel like a joke told at a funeral. "I'll think about it," I told her. It was the last calm, unremarkable sentence I ever said to Diane Calloway. The hearing took place on a gray Wednesday in October, in a courtroom that smelled, oddly, like the same lemon polish as the attorney's office where all of this began. Diane arrived expecting a routine estate dispute, the kind she'd clearly budgeted for, emotionally and financially, assuming I was simply a grieving daughter making noise. She wore navy instead of black this time, and she'd brought her own attorney, a heavy-set man named Dobbs, who kept glancing at his watch, like this was a formality he had somewhere better to be after. Renata Ossie stood and didn't raise her voice once. "Your Honor, on March the 4th, Mr. Calloway signed an amendment to his estate documents at 2:15 in the afternoon. His physician's chart, entered as Exhibit C, records that he received a sedating dose of pain medication at 1:40 that same day, a dose his own care team's notes describe as leaving him, quote, drowsy, slow to respond, not fully oriented. This was not an isolated incident. 6 of the 7 signings Mrs. Calloway has offered as evidence of her husband's intent occurred within 2 hours of a similar dose. Dobbs was on his feet. "Your Honor, sedation levels don't automatically negate capacity." "They don't," Renata said. "Calm, unhurried. Which is why we're not relying on the medical chart alone." She lifted the notarized statement. "We have Mr. Calloway's own words, witnessed by Brookhaven's patient advocacy office, stating plainly that he did not believe the documents reflected his wishes, and specifically naming his daughter as the person he intended to inherit the business and the majority of his estate." The judge, a woman with reading glasses pushed low on her nose, looked at Diane directly for the first time. "Mrs. Calloway, did you have knowledge of this statement prior to today?" "No," Diane said. Her voice, for the first time in 4 years of knowing her, wasn't smooth. "No, Your Honor, I did not." "And were you aware your husband met privately with a Brookhaven advocacy officer during the period in question?" Diane's mouth opened, then closed. "I believe that was a wellness check," she said finally. "That's what I was told." "By whom?" the judge asked. Diane didn't answer. I watched her face change in real time, sitting there in navy instead of black, watching the exact architecture of her plan get read back to her in a stranger's calm, unhurried voice. It is a very specific kind of collapse, watching someone realize that the thing they built in silence has been dismantled just as silently, and that they're only finding out about it in the moment it's already finished. The judge did not take long. The signings during documented periods of heavy sedation, combined with my father's own notarized statement of intent, were enough to void the most recent version of the will and revert the estate to its prior terms. The version drafted 4 years earlier, before Diane's involvement, splitting the estate primarily to me, with modest, fair provisions for her as his spouse, not zero. I want to be clear about that. I never asked to erase her, only to restore what was true. $2.3 million reverted to its rightful terms. The roofing company, all 22 years of it, came back to the daughter who'd learned to run it at her father's side before I ever learned to drive. People ask me sometimes if I hate Diane. I don't. Not really. Hate takes energy I'd rather spend elsewhere now, rebuilding the crew's morale, teaching myself the parts of the business I'd never touched, sitting on my father's porch some evenings just to feel close to him again. What I feel toward her is something closer to a strange, sad clarity. She wanted the ending without earning any of the story. She wanted the house, the accounts, the title of widow with none of the years that title is supposed to represent. And in the end, the truth didn't need me to fight for it nearly as hard as I feared it would. It only needed someone to keep the file, and someone patient enough to be found. My father spent his last competent weeks not confronting the woman changing his life out from under him, but quietly making sure the truth would outlast his silence. That is its own kind of courage, the kind that doesn't shout, doesn't confront, just documents, and waits, and trusts. I think about that a lot now. About how the people who show up, really show up, in the small, unglamorous hours nobody's watching, don't always win loudly or quickly. Sometimes the reckoning takes 8 months or 3 weeks, or a single phone call from a nursing home you'd almost forgotten existed. But it comes. And when it does, it doesn't ask you to have been cruel, or to have fought dirty, or to have kept score out of spite. It only asks that you were honest the whole time, and that somewhere, someone was keeping a record of who actually showed up. That's the only inheritance that ever really mattered to me. The rest was just paperwork, finally catching up to the truth.